Regarding what we're talking about today, Fuentes de Onoro, it's a 3-day battle, but why is this one, why are we talking about this? Why is this such an important battle?
Well, this one's really in the heart of the keys to Spain, between the border of Portugal and Spain. So we really are a stone's throw from Ciudad Rodrigo, and the other fort on the Portuguese side is the fort of Almeida. Both beautiful cities, towns, walled fortifications, and today and then they are very important. You needed to hold both in order to march effectively, keep marching along that road, and you will reach Madrid.
Right. And just background, obviously Napoleon invades Portugal first, then Spain. He does somewhat well initially, but, supplying your troops so far away from Paris, especially through the mountains of Spain, becomes quite difficult. So, as Marcus mentioned, you do have to control the forts that are around the roads of supply, correct?
Yes. I mean, if you almost draw a line from Porto, because it is Portugal's second city, to Madrid, you're kind of going through this area, and that's where the road goes. It's very mountainous on the Portuguese side, both high mountains and really low gorges, wide flowing rivers like the Coa and then the Tagus. And to cross those, you need the good roads, especially to move an army. That's what you're talking about. You're going at the speed of the slowest wagon. That's always the way that the armies really going to maneuver in the 1800s. So Fuentes de Onoro literally sits on the border. If you visit it today and you go around, you will be changing your clock every half an hour, because there's an hour's time difference between Portugal and Spain. And when we were giving the talk recently, I stood in Portugal and the group stood in Spain, so I had an hour's time difference between us over about 2 meters.
Wow.
So it's literally on the line of the border if you look at a map. And I think that kind of really it drives home. This is a border conflict that we're talking about. The invasion of Portugal, again, the last invasion of Portugal by the French. So we've done all of the opening conflict. We've done the lines of Torres, Vedras, and now Wellington's trying to capture Almeida, basically. So he's got a blockade in Almeida Fort, and he's outside there. And the French under Massena are coming down in order to relieve that siege.
Right.
So Wellington heads out and meets them here.
Right. Let's talk about the forces involved. On the French side, they have about 46,000 troops. On the British side, it's 36,000, but they're not all British, correct?
Yeah, in a classic Peninsula War army, they're not all British. The British regiments that are, you're looking at roughly a third of those being Irish, which obviously was part of Britain then, or part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But they are spread out throughout the regiments, famously. And we'll come on to some specific regiments later, especially the Connaught Rangers fight very gallantly. And then he's got a lot of Portuguese, and actually a little bit unusually for this one, they are a detachment of Portuguese guerrillas. Spanish guerrillas, actually.
Spanish, yeah.
Directly attached to Wellington's force as well.
Right. And as you mentioned, months earlier, the French had been repulsed, Battle of Busaco. If you want to learn about that one, you can see our earlier episode. And again, at the lines of Torres Vedras, and after camping outside the lines for months, the French strategically redeployed to the rear in Spain. And Wellington follows Massena's army cautiously, as the Russians found out at the Battle of Zurich 10 years earlier, Massena had the ability to strike like a cobra. So I think both commanders were kind of warily eyeing each other. And as you mentioned, as Wellington moves into Spain, he's attempting a siege of frontier cities like Almeida, which Massena is marching out to relieve. And that's kind of our background. I would like to talk about the topography of this small town, Fuentes de Onoro. It's not up on a mountain like Busaco, right? It's more of a flat.
No, not at all. No. So facing out east, you're looking directly along dusty roads towards Ciudad Rodrigo. And beyond that, it's the Spanish plains, the famous big flat open areas of Spain really is what we're talking about. So behind Wellington, a long way to the rear, you've got the River Coa, which is a relatively big river, but it's more that it's rocky than it is fast flowing. But the battlefield itself, pretty flat. There is a north-south running gentle, I wouldn't even go as far really as ridge, more of a slope, that Wellington can have some heights, and he can look he's just standing on the Portuguese side, looking towards Spain, which is where Massena's coming in from.
Mm-hmm. So flat means it works for cavalry, which probably helps Massena out. But this is again a battlefield that does Wellington pick this, you think, or is it just kind of where they smacked into each other?
It's a bit of both, effectively. So Wellington does get to pick it, but he doesn't get, the big open choices. He needs to be near to Almeida in order to prevent the siege being lifted. Mm-hmm. And when we say flat, lots of my friends and myself, I'm getting into myself, war game, and you put a table down, you put a cloth on it. Flat isn't flat. Flat isn't
right.
table flat. Something I always really keen off to talk about, like Waterloo. There's subtleties, and at Fuentes de Onoro, it's pretty flat, but there's some subtle ground that plays an important part. And in the middle, there is the village. It's like in England we'd say almost a hamlet. It's tiny, of the Fuentes de Onoro itself. And running just the edge of that on the Spanish side is the Dos Casas stream. I mean, you go there today and it's like you can see all the reeds and the lush grass and stuff, but I know you like to fish and you'd be thoroughly disappointed. It's like you're not getting your fishing rod out. You might get like your feet damp if you ran through it today. But it's a bit of like muddy ground. I think there was a little bit of water there in 1811, but it's not like a big wide Tagus or something like that we've got out there.
Okay. Well, the battle kicks off on May 3rd, 1811. Massena launches the assault against Wellington. How did the first day of battle go?
Yeah, so it's a really slow start. We get a battle in like 3 stages here. We get the 3-day battle. The first, Massena probes. He goes in. He goes into the village of Fuentes itself. The British have got pickets out, the sentry positions out just to the east on the Spanish side, and they get pushed back into the town, village. There's a small church, that's about it. And then close fighting takes place within that village, and this is something. So it's a really small inhabitant, but it's got high ground on both sides. This ridge. And so everything kind of gets channeled in, and it's really narrow dry stone walls that each like stone's about the size of an American football or rugby ball. And it's big, rough, I think granite, and like you brush against it, you'll cut yourself. It's really harsh kind of terrain.
Yeah.
The streets are really narrow, and so when you're in there, you can see that you wouldn't get, and we did it. You wouldn't get more than like 10 to 20 people shoulder to shoulder in this village. So as Massena's troops come in, they lose that integrity, but what they do have is a weight of numbers, and they force their way up to the top of the village. We see a repeat of this later. They force their way kind of into that heart of the village. It opens around the central square where the church is, and Wellington orders forwards the 71st Highland Light Infantry, who countercharge. These are your fierce Scottish warriors, typically from the lowlands, or what we call the south of Scotland, around the cities and the border areas. But they the difference is they're wearing trews, they're wearing trousers rather than kilts, and they fix bayonets and they charge in hand-to-hand combat, and in a big sweeping motion push out Massena's troops. And that's most of what we see. We see a bit of a feint in the north, towards the 5th Division and the Fort de Conception up there, but it's not really committed in the same way. So this is really the only fight. It's kind of feels like both commanders are just eyeing each other up, waiting to see what's to come.
It's like the first round of a heavyweight boxing match, just kind of like, probing and jabbing.
Probing, jabbing, getting their footwork in. Yeah. And then they've got like a bit of timeout. So the 4th of May, both sides sit down. They wait. We're waiting to see if any like reinforcements are coming. And actually, it's quite an interesting one that there's a little bit of, can we call it fraternization? So the troops down on the Dos Casas stream, they they meet, they shake hands, and they talk. And some people, like, they find there's a bit in common. I think there's a French officer that used to live in England, and he asked to hand on some letters to his friends in London, and they play like a game of chess, I believe. There's like a traveling chess set comes out, and there's a little bit of chatting and jolly.
I've never heard of that. I know there's that famous story of in World War I where the Germans and the Allied soldiers had a soccer game over. I think it was over Christmas Day or something.
The famous Christmas Day one, yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't know that happened as well in the Peninsula.
It's a much smaller scale. I know people always talk about the football at Christmas and is it true or not, and I'll leave that to the Order One historians. But yeah, there's definitely a bit of fraternization there. You know, it's a lull in fighting. There's no battles going on, and they are really close. You know, we often talk about like the Ranger and musket. It's about 80 yards, so the troops by nature have to get quite close.
Yeah.
And so these pickets are there. They fought the day before. I think the fighting the day before just sees about 200 casualties each side. It's quite light by that thing, and they treat those casualties on this day. So there's you know, a bit of Napoleonic surgery taking place within the camps, and that's just slows the pace of everything down.
And I'd like to talk about Massena's subordinates once again, because ultimately they fail him. Now, Busaco, he had Marshal Ney, but by this time he'd sent Marshal Ney home for insubordination. I think right after the lines of Torres Vedras, I think Massena wanted to launch another foray into Portugal, where Ney told him he was crazy, and Ney got sent home. So Massena still has Junot. He's got Marshal Bessieres kind of in reserve, who he's controlling the famed mounted grenadiers and dragoons of the Imperial Guard.
Yeah.
But like Napoleon, Bessieres was hesitant to throw these glittering columns into battle, which may have cost Massena this battle. And Massena is also starts to run low of ammunition in the third day of the battle, but we'll come to that. I think in this battle, Wellington is ably served by his subordinates, and Massena is not. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, he's got some names. They may not be kind of the household names, but they're certainly on the Arc de Triomphe. He's got Rainer, Solinac from Vimero, Ferre. He's going to be leading this attack. Durlon's there, of Waterloo fame, and Rainer's the flank man. So they seem to be experienced commanders. Yeah, but something doesn't quite gel together for them. If you're putting marshals and generals in a position that if you do well, you get titles, massive rewards. You know, you can effectively, if you do really well in Napoleon's army, you can run a country or you can own a country effectively. That there's that kind of element of, is it more competition than teamwork? I think that's where sometimes you get this. They've got all these talented guys who've come through the Revolutionary Wars and they're fighting for France. Now they're fighting for Napoleon, and that actually can mean like really big personal advancement as well.
Yeah.
So it would be very interesting to have been a fly on the wall of the officers' tents in the evening when the wine's flowing, because I can imagine there'd be some snide remarks. I'm imagining things now, but you're creating an element of competition in the workplace, effectively.
Yeah, indeed. And we'll get to Marshal Bessieres' lack of action here in just a bit. So what happens on this third day, the May 5th? So they just spend a day kind of regrouping, treating their wounded, and Massena's trying to figure out what to do next.
Yes. So firstly, Wellington does something quite unusual. He overextends his force down to the south, the other side of an even smaller village called Pocovelo. He deploys the 7th Division, a relatively new formed unit, nicknamed Wellington's Mongrels, because they've got all sorts of different units in there, including the Chasseurs Britanniques, who were French royalists on paper, but now they've got loads of French deserters, Czechs, Germans, Poles in their ranks. There's Brunswickers there. There's newly changed units, the 68th Durhams, who are now light infantry. So they're like a real mixing pot. And he extends them down the other side of Pocovelo. And their support is the Spanish guerrillas under Sanchez. You're looking at it going, okay, that's that's not the strongest force down there, and they're quite far away from the main units. The 1st and 3rd Division, and like Wellington, the 3rd Division, always known as the Fighting Third, kind of like the heart of Wellington's army. He detaches the light troops, so that's like a 10th of his force, each of the light companies, 22 light companies, into the village of Fuentes de Onoro itself, under a colonel from the famous 95th Rifles. So they're going to form it, and they're meant to be, light troops are meant to be using their initiative, a bit more intelligent, at least. That's the theory. And then he pushes up along the ridge the 5th and 6th divisions to hold that hilltop kind of area. So he's quite extended as well.
So is that a tactical error by Wellington? He overextended it?
Simply put, yes, it is. And he holds his light division back, and he massively overextends that 7th division. It looks like an area that he doesn't expect Massena to come up in, so it's going to be like, oh, it holds its flanks, but there's nothing really between the 7th division, a little bit of cavalry, and the core of the army, the 1st and 3rd division near the village. And it's a couple of kilometers, not very far, but far enough in Napoleonic warfare. And this is where like Massena sees that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And Massena, I mean, for all his faults, the guy knew strategy, and he knew an opportunity when he saw one. And as Wellington says later on, if Bonnie had been there, we would have been beat. Yeah. So what happens? What takes place as the day goes on?
So yeah, Massena does 3 things. He kind of feints again with Rayner's corps up in the north against the 5th and 6th divisions. He pushes Foray and a few others into the village, and we'll come back to that. And then he pushes largely his cavalry on a wide, his left, Wellington's right, flanking maneuver, and that hits the 7th division, who are overextended. So the guerrillas are no help down there, and the 7th division are caught. And that's why I said it's not flat. There is some dead ground. And that's why it's nice to go back and see these sites a second, third time, is to actually stand there and look for these kind of dead ground and see through, let's see a French brigadier cavalry commander's eyes where they can start to hide troops. And there's not loads of space that you'd hide thousands of troops, but a few hundred, and you're going to spot people and then lose them, and their big tall hats would be bouncing up and down, and you probably hear them. And they came up and they hit the 7th division, not being expected. And the certain units, including one of the guards actually, it's still in line when they're hit. There's a detachment of guards onto them from the 3rd, and they're in line. So this is the rock paper scissors of Napoleon.
Right, you don't want to be in line when the cavalry hits.
No, it's like I always say it's like rock paper scissors. You get into a square, and they're like that's hard rock, and the scissors blunt against them. But if you're in line, you're a thin bit of paper held taut, and it's like cutting your wrapping paper. It's the only time I ever cut anything like that is at Christmas. You want that sliding motion, don't you, with the scissors, trying to get everything nice and smooth.
Yeah.
And that's what they can do. And they slam into the 7th division, and now you've got a swirling maelstrom of cavalry around the squares, and also you've got like the rally squares where people just run back to back and form like a little huddle.
And in the meantime, how's Foray doing inside the town?
Yeah, so in the meantime, he does very well. It's different to the first day. And there's a lot more British in there. And he starts to work his way up. What the British are doing with these light troops is they're using like cover, and they're doing pairs, fire maneuver, covering each other back as they retreat up the streets.
Yeah, shoot and scoot.
Shoot and scoot, yeah. So one of you's firing, one of you's moves, and then as you reload, and the light troops are trained to like kind of reload as best they can as they're moving along, jogging. So they're doing that, and they're doing it on a larger scale as well. So it's slowing things down. And these are really narrow streets, so they're having to like somersault over some of the walls.
Right.
There's dead ends, and they'll be running down there, and they're doing it. So Foray's coming on. He's coming on for a long time, and he's suffering quite high casualties actually.
Yeah, and I read that around this time though, Massena, as I mentioned earlier, he's starting to run low on cannonballs, musket balls, ammunition. There's I think a company of French grenadiers who just ran out of ammo entirely and are just slaughtered at some point.
Yeah, they basically get cut off later. And yeah, Massena, he's like pounding the ridge above with his cannon, which kind of limited effect. The battle takes place in the village and down on the flank, actually. So by pounding away, it's not actually having the biggest effect as other battles. But he's, the village is heavily contested during that morning. Both sides, it's kind of hanging in the balance, and that gives Wellington a chance to look over and see what's happening with the 7th Division, and that he's made a mistake. There's no denying this. He has, and so he sends over the famous Light Division, and they have to go south in double time, so running effectively, a jog, and they cover the ground down to Pocovelo, where they can then support the 7th Division, who are like basically trying to move out that way. And what's really unique now is the Light Division forms square, and they have to march in and out square. So what the ideal situation is, you go into square, so you basically, your flanks turn back, and you do create it's more of a rectangle actually on paper, and they will then, once the cavalry move away and you've got a lull, you go back into actually a column rather than a line, so like a French attack column, and march away as quickly as possible, and then go back into square. What happens here is the French apply such pressure, because you think the way that they're causing casualties actually is riding up to people and shooting them in the face with a pistol or carbine more than actually with a sword.
Right.
And so the squares have to move in square, which is really difficult to do. Because you're meant to have people, you're meant to have 2 ranks kneeling, 2 ranks standing is the British method. I think that the Russians, for example, have all 4 ranks standing. So you've got people kind of like crouching or like stood up, who then having to turn and kneel, and that creates the 4 ranks. The front rank put their muskets down at 45 degrees and just kind of like ground it. The second rank kneel and fire. The third rank stand and fire over the kneelers, and the fourth rank kind of between the shoulders, and they can all get out. So it's the first rank are not really firing, and all 4 ranks have got bayonets fitted, and that creates a big wall of steel. The other thing that happens is actually the 95th Rifles, the famous riflemen of Sharp fame, and this is Sharp's battle for anyone who's following along the books and films. They actually get detached into some of the rocks and some of the hedges and things like that, and they hide off there and just kind of using themselves as marksmen and taking out French cavalry, probably like, aiming for the officers and the trumpeters as best they can. And that saves the 7th. The 7th have to like kind of get out there as quickly as possible. The Light Division take a lot of the pressure, and then they basically have to kind of, the 7th have to limp almost back home, and the Light Division do this amazing maneuvers where they're in and out square, double time, rifles swirling around with a huge amount of French cavalry. It's really impressive.
Yeah, indeed. And Light Division, that's a Black Bob Crawford's group, right?
Yes, it is. Who will not feature too much more in our stories, because he's
we're
gonna get killed soon. Yeah, okay. No spoilers. Excellent. So he dies at the storming of Ciudad Rodrigo and dies of his wounds there. This is about his iron discipline, Black Bob. For anyone who hasn't seen that episode, it's to do with his terrible temper, effectively.
Yeah, indeed. And but it's around this time, the French cavalry is taking some casualties, and Massena sends Charles Oudinot, who's the son of Marshal Oudinot. He's an aide-de-camp, and he sends him to the Imperial Guard, who are sitting in reserve, and he says, "Hey, I think it was Louis Lepic who was the general in charge. He's like, hey, you need to charge now, according to Massena." And what kind of happens there?
Yeah, it's Lepic, and he's just, as far as I'm aware, just refuses.
Yeah, he does.
It just there's not much reason. He's kind of like, no, these are, I believe the motivation is along the lines of, these are Napoleon's favorite troops. We're not going to release them.
Yep, and Marshal Bessieres is the only one who could release him, and he was off allegedly inspecting a series of ditches, which the army had passed a few days before. So I think Bessieres purposely, I don't know what you want to call it, if you want to call it treachery or just didn't want his brother Marshal to win that battle for whatever reason.
You think he's kind of tying his hands a little bit?
I don't know. He was a strange one, Bessieres, because he was really close with Napoleon. He was a good friend of Napoleon, but he almost got his marshal's baton just because they were friends. I don't know if he actually had any military talent. I know he won a few battles here and there in Spain, but I don't know if he had any he does something similar in Russia a few years later. I think his military acumen was limited, although he was very loyal to Napoleon.
Yeah, I mean, that's, we were saying earlier about recruiting and then creating rivalry. I mean, that's it. You are promoting people because they're your friends. I mean, the nepotism in the Napoleonic army is terrible. They are. He is definitely promoting people because he's fought with them in Italy and places. I mean, counter argument: the British system is to do a lot with wealth and then favourites of families and things like that. So it's not like, oh, I'm holding Britain up as a perfect example. Nowhere near. But there's a cult of personality in Napoleon's army, and it's his friends rather than the system that's kind of in the British way that's weighted. So his friends. So yeah, if he likes Bessieres, he's going to promote him. So
I will say that
it's a strange one that he's off, and it's particularly odd that Lepec, refuses to. They're the, as you said, the Grenadier cavalry. So they're the elite of the elite.
And so, kind of the moment's lost to the cavalry, and then what happens in the town? Are they finally pushed out, the French?
So the French push again back up to the top of the town, the village in this main square, and this is where Wellington unleashes some of his Gallic warriors. So he has the 71st Highland Light Infantry, the 79th Highlanders, and the 88th Connaught Rangers, who are famed for speaking very little English. So they're from quite the central south of Ireland, and Gaelic speakers primarily for their rank and file.
Yep.
And and then you've got two Scottish regiments, and I think the 24th as well, who are English, but are going to contain Irishmen as well. And so they fix bayonets and charge in en masse. Famously, the 80th Connaught Rangers in Gaelic war cries. One of the later mottos of the Royal Irish is Foa Bala, which is Gaelic for like mind out the way, basically get out the way or I'm going to stab you, is coming in at this point. And if you get a chance, there's a really good account for a young officer called Ensign Grattan, and Grattan, and he's brilliant for this because he's right there in the action, swinging his sword, and he writes his account like an adventure novel. Like if you like Sharp, you'll like reading Grattan, but it's true.
Okay.
So that's my top recommendation. And they charge in and they sweep out the village. So that's where you said, the Grenadiers get cut off. And they're kind of going down one part of the village, and they reach a dead end. I think there's about 100 of them, and they reach dead end. They turn around, and no mercy is given and no mercy is offered, and they're just like kind of bayoneted to death in that street.
Yeah.
So they are pushed out the village almost completely. Hand-to-hand fighting. It's back over the walls that had been fighting earlier. Put into your mind the muskets are quite a single-shot weapon. Because once you're in these quarters, you fire once, you can't reload. So if someone's coming at you, he's probably loaded. Statistically, you're going to assume he's loaded. But you see him fire,
right?
Actually, it's quite a vulnerable position because now he's just got the pointy end one side and a big butt of the right weapon the other. So it becomes very hand to hand. Tooth and claw, I think, would be more apt. It's pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah.
And the French aren't giving up by any accounts. They're being swept out, but they are fighting their ground.
Right. And with the cavalry, the reserve cavalry refusing to charge in fray, and the French comrades getting pushed out of the town, I think Massena realizes the opportunity is lost, and he kind of begins the retreat, I think, after that.
Yeah, there's just one other the anecdote I wanted to share about the 7th, actually. So they're supported by a guy called Norman Ramsay, who's leading a battery of guns known as Bull's Troop, because they're named after the commander, but Captain Bull isn't there. So Norman Ramsay's commanding the guns, and he gets cut off in the French cavalry charge. And two gunners are honor and tradition are held up in the guns rather than the colours, so we don't have flags because that would be impractical. So he's cut off, and so he not only wants to survive his life, obviously, and his men's lives, but he needs to survive and escape with the guns. And apparently this like whirling, swirling maelstrom of cavalry, he sees an opening back towards the north and Wellington's positions, and he does quite an unusual thing of he literally limbers up the guns, hooks them up, and gets all his men to draw swords, and they kind of charge away, apparently sword to sword combat with some of the French as they close back in. Gets away and actually manages to unlimber the guns and rejoin the action.
Wow.
So yeah, what you've kind of got by the end of the day is Wellington's brought the Light Division and the 7th Division back to his centre, and then the village has been this fiercely contested over. But you can imagine these Scottish and Irish warriors kind of reaching down towards the Doscassa stream, pushing the French over it, and then kind of like stopping for breath and water, and that kind of pauses the fighting. You know, the French have to turn on their heels, are pushed out. As you say, the Imperial Guard cavalry aren't committed, and it starts off quite like it did on the 3rd. You know, not a lot of a big maneuver outside of the southern bit, the 7th and the Light Division. So yeah, it's quite an interesting one from that point of view, that there's not these big maneuvers. Would you say?
Yeah, well, I want to talk aftermath, because it's strange with the Peninsula War, either like Lusaka, where really nothing changed other than a few, 1,000 casualties, or it's a very pivotal battle like Vimero, Corunna, Salamanca, or Vittoria, where a lot changes, and this is one of those where a lot changes afterwards.
Afterwards, it's quite different. So Wellington's able to go back to besieging Almeida, the fort, but actually the French commander manages to slip out in the middle of the night without firing a shot during that. Apparently Wellington's absolutely furious at that.
Yeah, in terms of the siege of Almeida, there's a 1,400-man French garrison that slips through, as you mentioned, the British-Portuguese lines at night. Only 360 French troops are captured, but the rest escapes. And an infuriated Wellington wrote afterwards, quote, "I have never been so much distressed by any military event as by the escape of even a man of them," end quote. I mean, why is he, what happened there?
Well, he's hoping to capture the town with all the French guns and with their commanders and their men, but they managed to return to the French lines and carry on their war. And he turns that onto Erskine, who's a really interesting case, because I don't know if it's diagnosed as combat stress as we'd have today or what, but he later kills himself. He throws himself out the window in Lisbon. It's not one of Wellington's most competent commanders, and actually he's removed from command after just randomly joining a cavalry command cavalry charge. Sorry, that has nothing to do with in the middle of one battle. So slightly unstable man, but the French do very well to slip out at night.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Massena himself though is recalled, and apparently when he arrives back in Paris, apparently he had long black hair before he went, and now he's looking a bit disheveled, and apparently there's a quote about he had not one black hair left on his body, he'd gone grey all over, quote. And do you remember what was said to him?
Oh yeah, indeed. He said, so Prince of Essling, you're no longer Massena, by Napoleon, which I think is just a brilliant dig. I mean,
it's a cut, isn't it?
It is a cut, but if you think of Busaka, where the French lost 4,000 in this battle, actually, we should talk about casualties briefly, if you want to talk about that.
We didn't. Sorry, we didn't mention that. So it's about 2,500 French casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, and it's just about 1,500+ Allies killed, wounded, and captured. So it's not high casualties compared to some of the bigger actions, but there's a noticeable difference there between the British and the French. But you can definitely see 2,500 there in favour of the French taking more. That they were badly mauled. They started off the battle with more troops, and they certainly come off worse of it. And they're having to. They've also failed to their main objective, which was to relieve the siege of Almeida. It just so happens that the garrison of Almeida are quite savvy and managed to get away.
Yeah, and but even Wellington realized how close he was. Like, he didn't mark it down as a victory. He was like, we were lucky to get out of that one.
Yeah, as you said earlier, he says we would have lost it if Boney hadn't been there. So he thinks it's close. If things had gone very slightly differently, he would have lost. And it's really a very interesting one to see that the village is so small, and you're packing a good amount of the army into that tiny village. And as always, I'll share some photos and videos of the streets, and it's particularly one of these ones that as a village that is, people have continued to inhabit. There's actually they built a new village down the road where most people live, but the old village, it feels like nothing's ever changed. Like you don't see anyone there when you visit it, except if it's another tour group. It's kind of like all locked up little houses, exactly where they stood, like goats and donkeys in the field. You feel like, it's a little time capsule, but that tight packed of this rough stone, it just feels really, dangerous, I think actually would be the word I'd be looking for.
Right. And if I may zoom out a little bit on the geopolitical or macro scale, it does two things, I think. One, it gets the French permanently out of Portugal. They never invade again. And two, it cost Massena his military career, and he is one of Napoleon's best generals, and he never goes really back into the field after that.
Yeah, I mean, the last invasion of it's a big thing for Portugal. They suffered very badly under French occupation. I think I've mentioned it before, but the killed and wounded of the civilians, how they suffered by the French is slightly overlooked. So I always want to highlight, the Portuguese certainly gave as good as they got, as much as they could back against captured French soldiers and officers. They, did do torturing and butchering as well, but the French were doing that against civilians.
Right.
And there's also a huge element of starvation as well as robbery and looting. And there's certainly items in parts of France today that started in Portugal, shall we say. But Massena was one of Napoleon's most talented. Can I be as bold to say?
Yeah, I'd say. I mean, certainly top 5 or top 3 if you want to get into it.
Start doing some lists. I know a guy who's very good at lists of commanders. Actually, I watched a live stream recently.
But then, if you talk about the battles of the Peninsula War, I mean, this has got to be one of the top 5 as well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but it's from that kind of what if, kind of how would you fight it kind of perspective. Massena doesn't hold command again. Wellington goes on, and now he's starting to look at Ciudad Rodrigo and eventually, Madrid, and all the way into south of France. He's starting to go on a forward offensive battle and campaigns now. But he comes so close. If people war game this, if you put the 7th Division off on the flank, they're gonna be really. You need a big bit of gap, and the French can exploit that. The fact they weren't all rounded up by the French cavalry, cut off or cut down and killed, is kind of a highlight to the battalion and brigade level commanders of the light division that really saved the day and actually I'd probably say down to the junior officers and the NCOs who kept people in line in the square. French cavalry are good. They are an elite force just by nature at this point. And 1811, before the famous invasion of Russia, you've got some veteran troops, and they're fierce, and they've got the French Ilan, and a lot of flair in the French cavalry, and they just weren't able to break those squares.
And what's that? There's a quote by Wellington. I think it's something: "When I make a mistake, my men get me out of it, and when Marshal Soult or Massena makes a mistake, his men don't."
Yeah, so he's referring to them as his men's uncanny ability to, dig their heels in. He says whatever. Yeah, with my troops pull me out of it, and that's what he's referring to. That things like this, this would probably be arguably Burgos, one of his biggest blunders as well. It's not a clean fight. This is very much saved by those individual men, which is worth paying tribute to as well.
Right, indeed. Well, thank you for that overview, my friend. We covered a lot there. That was a pretty interesting battle, Fuentes de Onoro. And what if someone wants to tour that area? What would you recommend?
Yeah, it's quite easy to see some of the highlights. You can get into the the village centre, so you can park down on the stream, down on Dos Casas. So it's now a big concrete kind of slabs over the stream, but you can start there. There's I think a little cemetery to your back, and then you can imagine yourself in the feet of the French attackers, cross the stream and go up slowly through all these little narrow streets, and they open out and they go narrow again, and then you end up in the square where lots of the fighting take place. And if you're adventurous enough, you can find some higher ground and then turn around and look back down on it. And then it's only like a 5-minute drive down to Portobello. And yeah, we found out you can't quite get coach down to the position of the squares, but you can get a car. So we, you had to get off the coach, but
okay,
you can go and stand there, and then you're actually on the Portuguese-Spanish border. There's lots of signs, which is quite fun, and you can then look back and see the dead ground that Massena's cavalry would have come up. You can also go to see that some of the north, where the 5th and 6th British divisions were, but that's a little bit more built up, kind of now where the main border crossing is. But you can certainly get into the village quite easily. And yeah, it's quite famous for some paintings in the village and some scenes in Sharp. So it's a nice one to visit, and it's a stone's throw from lots of other battles out there as well. Say Combat Macoa, Almeida, Ciudad Rodrigo, all within like 15-20 minutes drive. So it's a good one to explore, really is.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you for that on the ground reporting that you did for us. And again, Marcus has a book coming out in May 2024, and the title of the book is
Let the Men Cross.
Yeah. Wellington's famous quote from the Battle of Oporto. So thank you for that as well.
You're very welcome. Thank you again for your support. And hey, listeners, support John, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff for General Napoleon.
And I didn't even tell him to say that. That's fantastic. Thanks, my friend. And yeah, we look forward to having you on the show once again very soon.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be on.
Thank you.